Welcome to Chartwell Booksellers. My name is Barry Singer. I'm the proprietor, something I neglected to mention the last time we were here. For those of you tuning in for the first time, we're the only bookshop in the world devoted to the works of Winston Churchill. We've been around for 36 years and counting. And from time to time, when an important book appears about Winston Churchill, we invite the author to come speak to us about it, live here in the store and also streaming on our YouTube channel. Piers Brendon is a Churchill scholar of the first rank, whom we welcome this evening as a guest we have been waiting for. His presence here at Chartwell is long overdue. Mr. Brendon was keeper of the Churchill archives at Churchill College, Cambridge from 1995 to 2001. He was succeeded there by our friend Alan Packwood, who addressed us earlier this year. Mr. Brendon's Churchill, A Brief Life, was published in 1984, just a few months after we opened, and it is a great place to begin one's reading about Winston Churchill. The more one strips away the iconography of the great man, Winston Churchill, the more one finds a fascinating, very human being. One of the central aspects of that human being was his deep, abiding love of animals of every shape and variety. He surrounded himself with animals throughout his life. We owe Mr. Brendon our gratitude for taking Churchill's love of animals to heart and giving us this book, Churchill's Menagerie, Winston Churchill and the Animal Kingdom. Ladies and gentlemen, Piers Brendon.
Thank you very much, Barry, for that introduction, and thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure to be in this legendary place, and I've not been here before, but I've heard all about it from my successor, Alan Packwood, and it's just amazing. I've never seen anything like it outside our own dedicated library to Churchill in the Roskill Library in the Churchill Archive Centre, where I was keeper for 6 years. Alan is director. That's one pip up on me, but I appointed him, so he's taken advantage of that to improve his status. Anyway, I'm going to talk, as Barry has said, about Churchill and the Animal Kingdom. And this slide that the first one, is a picture of Churchill drawn for me by Helen Oxenbury, who is responsible for We're Going on a Bear Hunt. Some of you got grandchildren will probably, or children who may know her. She's probably the best drawer of bears in the entire world. And this is a perfect visual epitome of the book, Churchill Shaking Hands with a Bear. It's a study of his fascination with the animal kingdom, based largely on original documents, but presented in the form of an ancient bestiary. Hence the British title, Churchill's Bestiary, which almost certainly was a mistake, since I'm told that few people know that this word means compendium of beasts, and that bookshops are liable to place it on the groaning shelves that they devote to bestiality. And as a matter of fact, Hatchard's, the bookshop in Piccadilly, a famous bookshop in Piccadilly, told me that the first somewhat excited inquiry about my book was from a customer who thought that it really did relate to Churchill and bestiality. Which is perhaps a unique selling point. I think I missed a trick there, but understandably, my American publishers, who are more sensible than my British ones, didn't change my title, and so here it's Churchill's Menagerie. However, to be clear, I aim to show via the many animals marching through my pages that Churchill was innocently but in a quite extraordinary fashion preoccupied, amused, intrigued, enchanted, and besotted by creatures great and small. They included lions, leopards, kangaroos, horses, goats, dogs, swans, budgerigars, butterflies, and fish, right down to ants, bugs, locusts, flies, and tins of exceptionally well-bred maggots that he made a point of purchasing from Yorkshire at a cost of 22 shillings and sixpence a week to feed his cherished goldfish and golden orf. Aristocratic maggots, these are, he sometimes said. Look how well the fish are doing on them. As this remark indicates, the book is lit up by Churchill's incomparable wit, his ebullient personality, and his patrician eccentricity. But although it's a jeu d'esprit, it's no mere entertainment. I hope and think it is entertaining, but that's not the whole thing, because Churchill's preoccupation with animals was not just a jokey, trivial, or incidental aspect of his life. Rather, as I'll try to show, it was important for a whole host of reasons, and it has been neglected. As keeper of the archives, I could see that the files were simply not used. Why would people go to files about his black swans? Well, the answer is they didn't. And yet, such is the wealth of material there that it's given me ample raw material for a book. Let's take an example as to why Churchill's love for animals is illuminating in various ways. Take his love of horses, for example. These were creatures which embodied a romance wholly absent from machines, and they illustrate the crucial dichotomy, the crucial division in his worldview. On the one hand, he appreciated the revolutionary potential of science and technology, cars, tanks, aeroplanes, and so on. He initiated, in some respects, the whole tank movement in the First World War, so he did understand all that. On the other hand, he deplored the replacement of the noble quadruped by what he called the infernal combustion engine, infernal rather than internal. And here, I think, is a key paradox about Churchill, that his faith in a technological future was always tempered by his nostalgia for a chivalric past. And given his illustrious ancestry, such nostalgia was understandable. Churchill, born in Blenheim Palace in 1874, the grandson of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, was about as blue-blooded as it's possible to be on his father's side. He set much store by pedigree, not just in humans, but in horses, dogs, and much humbler creatures. For example, he maintained that his goldfish and golden orf were a cut above finny plebeians or proletarians, such as vulgar tench or horribly common pike, who were coarse fish in every sense of the word, he maintained. Furthermore, to explore another key paradox, Churchill conformed to the upper-class convention that a gentleman spent much of his time hunting, shooting, and fishing, while doting on the horses, hounds, and other furred or feathered friends with which he surrounded himself at home. As a small boy, he was a keen bug hunter, adept at netting butterflies, dragonflies, and moths. As a youth, he was encouraged by his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, to pursue game with hound, gun, and rod. All his life, he revelled in the excitement of the chase, and he told his mother, Jenny Née Jerome, who was American, of course, that fox hunting was the greatest pleasure in the world. In India, he became an ardent hog hunter, or pig sticker. In Africa, he shot everything from crocodiles to ostriches, including, among many other large quadrupeds, 3 rare white rhinoceroses, thus sparking off a spirit of emulation in Teddy Roosevelt, who did precisely the same thing when he got to Kenya slightly later than Churchill. In France, Churchill hunted wild boar with furious energy. I love this picture because of the expression on his face. He was always determined to be in at the kill. And he would certainly, I think, have agreed with Montaigne that hunting without killing is like having sexual intercourse without an orgasm. At Balmoral, he once dispatched 3 stags in a single day, and throughout his career he enjoyed shooting grouse, pheasants, snipe, and partridge, and catching trout and salmon. So that's the one side of his character. On the other side, from his infancy upwards, he was devoted to animals. He kept guinea pigs and tame bunnies while slaying wild rabbits. He had an affinity with felines and signed himself in his letters home the Pussycat. At prep school, that's pre-high school, I suppose, he was smitten by a dear little fox terrier puppy. And at Harrow, which we called his public school, but that was his main school, he bred silkworms, and he sold his bicycle to buy a bulldog, the purpose of which, as you can see, or may be able to see from this letter from his fond nanny, the purpose of which escaped her, Mrs. Everest, unless it is all to keep us in terror of our lives, she said. Subsequently at Chartwell, his pocket Blenheim in Kent, Churchill accumulated an extensive menagerie. He lavished care, cash, and emotion on the well-being of its inmates, who became part of his extended family, and he always referred to them in comically refined terms. So dogs did not make messes on the carpet, they committed indiscretions. Cows did not breed, they attended to their family affairs. Fish were not pregnant, but in an interesting condition. Dwelling amid flora and fauna, he said, was the ideal form of existence. In fact, he went further, once remarking, the world would be better off if it were inhabited only by animals. Robert Boothby, who was his personal private secretary in the House of Commons at some point in the 1920s, exaggerated when he said that Churchill had little regard for human life, least of all his own, but that he would cry over the death of a swan or a cat. But it is true that Churchill was moved to tears when contemplating the area bombing of Germany during the Second World War. And this is what he said. Tens of thousands of lives were extinguished in one night. Old men, old women, little children. Yes, children about to be born. And pussycats. The lisping delivery, combined with the pathetic conclusion, provoked nervous mirth among those at the dinner table. And when Churchill detected it, he turned like a flash and said in deadly earnest, "When I mention pussycats, I would not have you think I take them lightly." However, Churchill expected his own felines to face the Blitz bravely, and he was mortified when his black cat Nelson hid under a chest of drawers at number 10 during an air raid. "Come out, Nelson," he commanded. "Shame on you, bearing a name such as yours, to skulk there when the enemy is overhead." Blackie, here we see him, was evidently a truer embodiment of the traditions of the senior service. As I've suggested, Churchill's ambivalence towards the brute creation was not unique. English aristocrats and others had no difficulty in reconciling their traditional addiction to blood sports with a fondness for animals. Here is actually a relatively middle-class person. He was a fairly prosperous Cornish farmer with other interests. And I put him in because he happens to be my great-grandfather. So he wasn't grand, really, at all. He was fairly well off, as you can see from that get-up. But it's to illustrate the fact that fox hunting was a kind of almost a universal creed among a certain class of people. But Churchill was different. Churchill related to animals in a highly idiosyncratic fashion. Such was his empathy for the livestock farmed at Chartwell, for example, that he opposed the slaying of any creature to whom he had said good morning. On one memorable occasion, he asked his wife Clementine to carve the goose because it was a friend of mine. And on another, he hesitated to carve a large roast chicken. Clementine said, well, why don't you get on with it? And he replied in a voice fraught with emotion, I'm just wondering if this is Ethel. Churchill engaged with animals on a personal level. Of course, many people talk to their pets and to other creatures, endowing them with language in a vain endeavour to bridge the gulf that lies between the species. But Churchill was the complete anthropomorphist. More than most, he invested animals with human characteristics and communicated with them as individuals. Thus, he offered his thoroughbred colt, Colonist II, an enticing reward for victory, which apparently explained why he would why Colonist came forth in this particular race. I told him, this is a very big race, and if he won, he would never have to run again, but spend the rest of his life in agreeable female company. Colonist II did not keep his mind on the race, said Churchill, and that's why he came forth. Churchill wrote letters to and from his poodle, Rufus, an animal it was hard for others to like because of his appalling halitosis. One private secretary said that Rufus had breath like a flamethrower. But Churchill doted on him and made elaborate endeavours to arrange his marital affairs. And here you can see a letter that's marked very private. I don't know whether you can read it. This is a proposal from Rufus to this dog Jennifer, so that Rufus can become the father of Jennifer's child. I'm not sure how these letters were written. There are quite a lot of them in the archives. Presumably secretaries did it. But you can understand why Churchill wanted them kept private. Churchill absolutely doted on Rufus. He sat him on his lap during films, and he coddled him and made much of him. He loved these cinematic performances. And once, when they were watching the scene in Oliver Twist, in which Bill Sikes prepares to drown his dog's called Bullseye, if you remember, to put the police off his track, Churchill covered Rufus's eyes with his hands and said, "Don't look now, dear. I'll tell you about it afterwards." Churchill held telepathic conversations with his sheep Friendly. The wonderful instance he gives in a letter to Clemmy, I think, of his sitting there at table at Chartwell and she's away, and suddenly occurs to him that he'd like to give some bread to Friendly. And all of a sudden, the sheep Friendly comes over the hill and comes down the hill and starts trotting and then cantering and then galloping down the hill. And Churchill got together a whole lot of bread and went down, fed the sheep Friendly. And he said that this was a remarkable instance of Friendly's occult intelligence. Churchill doted on cats, I think, probably most of all. On the 3rd of June, 1941, for example, when he was worried about military setbacks in North Africa, he had a lunch at Chartwell, which was closed up mostly during the war, with his private secretary, Jock Colville. And Colville recorded in his diary that Churchill kept up a running conversation with the cat, cleaning its eyes with a napkin, offering it mutton, and expressing regret that it could not have cream in wartime. So he ignored Colville, who was sitting there, and just talked to the cat. Churchill corresponded with dear Nelson, too. He's another of Churchill's correspondents, despite Nelson's cowardice. And so that you get these wonderful things, a card from Nelson saying many happy returns, and then Churchill writes back to Nelson saying thank you very much for your birthday greetings. Churchill also had an adoring relationship with his azure blue and emerald green budgie Toby, that's the best photograph I can get. It's on the Onassis yacht of Toby. But he acquired Toby in 1954, and it was a real love affair. Toby pecked at Churchill's cigars. He trotted across the dining room table. He fought with his reflection in the silver pepper pot and chattered like a schoolgirl at a picnic, it was said. Moreover, Toby literally made his mark on visitors, in the course of one call making no fewer than 14 messes on the bald head of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, R.A. Butler. The Chancellor was amused, though Churchill called him old cock, while he called Toby darling. Wiping his pate with a white silk handkerchief, Butler sighed. The things I do for England, he said. Vivian and I are going to celebrate at Lambeth Palace the 90th birthday of Churchill's last secretary, Jane Williams. And Toby used to, in about a week's time, Toby used to sit on her shoulder, on her head, on her elbow, and so on, while she was dictating. Made life very difficult for Jane while he was giving dictation. But Toby was the privileged one there. And Churchill was so keen on Toby that he determined to purchase a similar bird for Field Marshal Montgomery. But in deference to Monty's strict standards of temperance, Churchill stipulated that his budgie should be a teetotaler. In August 1942, when Churchill first visited the Kremlin, he attempted to convey his enthusiasm for goldfish to Stalin. It was a piquant episode, really, in his career, which perfectly illustrates the gulf between the soft-hearted Western Democrat and the blood-stained Oriental despot. Churchill told Stalin that he was very fond of goldfish, and the Soviet leader hospitably invited him to have some for breakfast. In the 1950s, Churchill became even more infatuated, if possible, with tropical fish, filling Chartwell and Chequers with large tanks full of slivers of quicksilver, a living kaleidoscope, a glittering piece of kinetic art. As if mesmerized, Churchill would gaze at them for 20 minutes at a time, extolling their beauty, admiring their colours, and exclaiming on their antics. He also endowed them with human personalities, and he dilated on their love life, all the while puffing away at a cigar. Once he was overheard addressing one of his guppies, the tropical minnows, in these terms: "Darling, I do love you. I would make love to you if only I knew how." Churchill also doted on goats. He went to considerable trouble to ensure that the Welch Fusiliers formed the Guard of Honour at his summit meeting with President Eisenhower and the French Premier Joseph Laniel in Bermuda in 1953, because their regimental mascot was a beautiful white goat called Billy, with whom I had made friends in Jamaica, he said. Actually, this goat made diplomatic waves in Bermuda. It caused much indignation in the French press when Churchill lavished far more attention on the goat than he did on Laniel. At the concluding banquet, Churchill had Billy ceremonially paraded round the table at Government House, where the Prime Minister rewarded the goat with a glass of champagne, which it accepted, and the President gave it a cigarette, which it rejected. Afterwards, Churchill wrote to Ike explaining that he should not take this rejection personally, as Billy had informed him that he understood there was no smoking on parade. Ike replied that he was impressed by the goat's soldierly deportment, and he was also very amused by Churchill's devotion to the goat, which helped to ease Anglo-American relations, which were strained because of the differing attitudes that they had towards a summit with Soviet Russia. Churchill wanted one, Ike didn't. In fact, Churchill had Catholic tastes in animals. He was keen on parrots, despite the fact that his own sometimes bit him, provoking bellows of unparliamentary language. Along with other wildfowl, ducks were honoured guests at Chartwell, And when he received some coom duck from India in 1934, Churchill said that he hoped by firm government to make them loyal subjects. It was a joke about his attitude towards the Indians, which was highly reactionary. Churchill treasured his cows, and on arriving in Normandy after the successful D-Day landings, he coined a richly bucolic image to express his joy. "We are surrounded by fat cattle lying in luscious pastures with their paws crossed." When playing golf, he once removed a worm from the fairway, saying, "Poor fellow, if I leave you here, you will be trampled by some ruthless boot." When a ladybird landed on his nightclothes in 1949, he asked General Pownall to remove this exquisite and charming creature from my sleeve and allow it carefully to fly out of the window. Churchill delighted in circuses, carnivals, fairs, and zoos, enjoying especially the frolics of wrestling bears and acrobatic sea lions. He was particularly devoted to London Zoo, where a number of his animals were housed at different times, notably big beasts that were presented to him. In 1943, he was given a lion called Rota, and he sent this letter to the Duke of Devonshire, who served on the zoo's council. The zoo weren't quite sure that he wanted a lion, and they were offered it rather tentatively. And Churchill replied in a wonderful letter in which he said, "I shall have much pleasure in becoming the possessor of the lion, on the condition that I do not have to feed it or take care of it, and that the zoo makes sure that it does not get loose. You are quite right in your assumption that I do not want a lion at the moment, either at Downing Street or Chequers." Chequers is the Prime Minister's country house. "Either at Downing Street or Chequers, owing to the ministerial calm which prevails there. But the zoo is not far away, and situations may arise in which I shall have great need of the lion." he liked visiting and feeding Rota, and he once did threaten to make a diminutive secretary the lion's next meal, saying that meat is very short now in the time of rationing. But the lion actually took Churchill for a ride. It was called Rota after a German printing machine company called Rota Press, it was called. And the pre-war manager of this company had acquired the lion from a circus as an advertising ploy. This man's name was George Thompson. But he kept it in the suburbs of London, and the neighbours didn't like the idea of having a lion as living next door to them, even though it was quite a gentle lion. And so they complained about this, and eventually George Thompson gave it to the zoo, and the zoo asked if Churchill would like it, and of course he saw the propaganda advantages of having a lion very, very clearly. But unfortunately, George Thompson stipulated that when the lion died, he should have the skin. And so that was agreed. And eventually, after siring many cubs, the lion did die, Rota did die, in 1955. And Thompson then had the lion stuffed and exhibited in a Piccadilly showroom, though Churchill prevented him from using his most famous leonine quotation delivered in his famous speech, remember, on his 80th birthday. "It was the nation and the race dwelling all round the globe that had the lion's heart. I had the luck to be called upon to give the roar." And Rota was stuffed, and eventually he was sold, and he crossed the Atlantic, and he is now to be seen on display in the Leitner Museum in St. Augustine, Florida, if you would care to pay a pilgrimage to see Rota. The zoo also accommodated Churchill's leopard Sheba, some of his black swans and tropical fish, and 2 white kangaroos, a token of esteem from South Australia. These he received in 1947, saying that he didn't mind the publicity and the photographers could snap him as much as they pleased in the kangaroo's pouch, if they like, with my legs all sprawling about. Furthermore, the zoo assisted with other animal transactions whereby Churchill cemented his friendship with President Roosevelt by a gift of Chartwell goldfish, and anticipating modern panda diplomacy, he tried to mend his fences with Australia by importing a duck-billed platypus. Housed in a specially built platypussery on board the ship, It was transported from Australia, and it was supplied with 750 specially selected worms every day, supplemented, I discovered, charmingly, by helpings of custard, which it liked. But the voyage took longer than expected, and by the time the vessel reached the Panama Canal, its daily diet was cut to 600 worms, and the ship's master had to employ locals to dig up a further 8,000 worms. And unfortunately, the platypus didn't like Panamanian worms, so it was in a reduced condition when, near the end of the Atlantic crossing, the ship was attacked by a German submarine and retaliated with depth charges. Alas, the explosions further upset the creature's delicate mechanism. Its duckbill contained electrosensory organs for hunting. They were very delicate indeed. They could detect the passage of a mosquito. And the platypus died. Churchill was most upset, and he kept this failed operation a deadly secret, though he made the best of it by having the animal stuffed and presenting it to the Royal College of Surgeons. You can see that he would have made it a great propaganda triumph and mended his fences with Australia, which was damaged by the disaster of Singapore. Churchill relished animal stories, especially those of Kipling. He confessed to roaming the jungles with Mowgli and fighting for dear life in the skin of the mongoose Rikki-Tikki-Tavi against the cobra nag. In fact, animals occupied a key place in his imagination. He identified with them, and they supplied his family and perhaps even a premarital girlfriend with terms of endearment. You can't really read this. It's something that I discovered in the archives, and it's very, very extraordinary. This is the first time it's been revealed. It's a letter from, I assume, a girlfriend in 1906, 2 years before he married Clemmy. And she realizes who he is, but then she says that she's reading a novel that he'd written. And the novel was written by, indeed, Winston Churchill. The trouble was, the Winston Churchill who wrote that novel was not the Winston Churchill that I'm talking about. It was the novelist, the American novelist Winston Churchill. So she got very confused about this. And it's a most mysterious letter. But the point of the animal story about it is she signed herself Your Loving Pink Frog, and that presumably was a nickname that Churchill gave to her. So we don't quite know about this. I've tried very hard to follow it up. And it makes an interesting but rather inconclusive story. Churchill found nicknames with animal nicknames for all his family too. He was Pug or Pig to Clementine's cat. Returning home, he would utter a sharp woof woof, answered by her enthusiastic meow. And they often ended their letters to each other with sketches of their four-footed avatars. Their offspring, collectively known as the kittens, had individual nicknames, animal nicknames. The puppy kitten, Diana, the rabbit, Randolph, the bumblebee, Sarah, later called the mule because she was stubborn and wouldn't breed, and the duckadilly, Marigold, who died young. Whenever you write a book, you always find out things later that you should have put in and you didn't. And somebody at the conference I've just been attending in Washington told me that Churchill would say to Clementine that they were good parents, they looked after their children, liked them. Let's take one of the kittens out of the basket. And I wish I'd had that story. And it was he'd heard that from, I can't remember who, one of the Churchill family. Unlike many patricians, as I say, he who notoriously preferred their horses and dogs to their children, Churchill was very affectionate. He played animal games with his brood. Here he is playing bears with their son Randolph. And he chased them in the guise of a bear or a gorilla. The latter he imitated with uncanny accuracy, crouching behind bushes and jumping out with his arms swinging limply, baring his teeth, beating his chest, and emitting a blood-curdling roar of grr, grr. Perhaps his impersonation was enhanced by the fact that, in the opinion of David Lloyd George at any rate, Churchill physically resembled a gorilla. During the course of his career, needless to say, he was likened to a fantastic variety of creatures. Among them a caterpillar. I was very pleased about this one. There he is as a young war correspondent. and it's a bit, it's sort of skit on Alice in Wonderland. Fantastic variety of creatures: caterpillar, rat, lion, warhorse, chicken, maggot, mongrel, porpoise, dinosaur, bulldog, inebriated dragon, wild boar, rogue elephant, you name it. Churchill was compared to it. He seemed to compel animal analogies. In a single dispatch to the Foreign Office, Britain's somewhat louche ambassador to the Soviet Union, Archie Clark Carr, likened Churchill, who was visiting Moscow in 1942, to a bull about to charge, its eyes bloodshot and defiant, to a wounded lion, to a protean creature able to transform its features from the most laughing, dimpled, and mischievous baby's bottom into the face of an angry and outraged bullfrog. And Clark Carr embellished this dispatch. It's in the Public Record Office. Never been published, I think, so you are privileged to see, I think, the only sketch that exists of the naked Prime Minister, or half-naked Prime Minister. That was his bedclothes, actually. He tended to go to bed in the sort of kind of nightshirt kind of thing. Churchill himself pullulated with animal analogies. His head was a virtual Noah's Ark, bursting with figures of speech. In fact, animal imagery loomed almost as large in his rhetoric as the military metaphors for which, as a soldier, he instinctively reached. Churchill exploited sheep, pigs, and other creatures as a source of personal amusement or oratorical entertainment, by which he brilliantly disarmed opposition in the House of Commons. He once told Labour MPs, "I do not wish to cast my pearls before those who do not want them." So he didn't actually say swine, even though that's probably what he thought the Labour MPs were. Sometimes he was less amiable. After Clement Attlee succeeded him as Prime Minister, Churchill remarked, unfairly but unforgettably, "If any grub is fed on royal jelly, it turns into a queen bee." When Attlee's cabinet colleagues misbehaved in his absence, Churchill said, "When the mouse is away, the cats will play." And he likened General de Gaulle to a female llama surprised in her bath. De Gaulle, for obvious reasons, is normally compared to a giraffe because he was so tall. But Vivian found this picture, and I think a llama is, there's a good likeness, isn't it? The nose is quite good. The ears are a bit odd, but definitely something there, I think. Churchill ransacked the wilderness for bestial analogies with which to stigmatize his fiercest foes. He rejected a rapprochement with Nazi Germany by recalling the fable of the jackal who went hunting with the tiger and what happened after the hunt was over. He also branded Mussolini as a jackal, and still more obnoxious, a hyena. One of his most memorable taunts was directed at those French generals who had prophesied in 1940 that within 3 weeks England would have her neck wrung like a chicken, and you can all do it for me, some chicken, some neck. The Soviet Union further tested, though by no means exhausted, his feral lexicon. He represented the Bolsheviks as snakes, wolves, vultures, crocodiles, bears, vampires, typhus-bearing vermin, the tapeworm inside the Russian dog, the nameless beast foretold in Russian legend, and above all, as baboons, hopping and capering amidst the ruins of civilization and the corpses of their enemies. When a Soviet trade delegation led by Leonid Krasin visited London in 1920, Churchill asked the Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon, "Did you shake hands with a hairy baboon?" In using animals as emblems of virtue and vice, Churchill was drawing on a tradition that stretched from Aesop to Orwell, who of course depicted the communist leaders as pigs. And Churchill himself had a gift for fashioning fables. He adored butterflies and explained to his young nephew Johnny that caterpillars that were greedy and lazy were punished in their next world by becoming drab meadow browns or common heaths and living short, miserable lives, whereas a good caterpillar would become a gorgeous swallowtail or a painted lady or even a Camberwell beauty and may be allowed to hibernate for the winter and enjoy the spring the following year. So that's the kind of thing that he went in for. And he had a particularly compelling fable, which I can't recount in detail. It's too long to quote. But it was designed to expose the folly of interwar disarmament. And it shows how each of the animals got together and they were each willing to give up the weapons like horns, teeth, claws, and so on, which they did not possess, but they weren't willing to give up the weapons that they did possess. And their meeting, of course, dissolved into almost a conflict of its own. Such symbolism had a universal appeal. Animals are among the earliest denizens of the child's mind. This is Helen Oxenbury again. They help to shape the adult consciousness. They're integral to the culture of Homo sapiens. They've been objects of veneration and detestation, victims of cruelty and sacrifice, subjects of art, literature, and myth, participants in war, work, and play, but once a source of danger and a wellspring of health and happiness. They're slaughtered for food, but alive they nourish the human imagination. They're made of our common clay, but without the power of speech. They are alluring, but mysterious. So that, to quote Montaigne again, when we play with our cat, we're never quite sure whether we are playing with it or it is playing with us. And thus animals become a screen onto which human beings down the ages have projected their own attributes: meek lamb, cunning fox, savage bull, busy bee, and so on. Churchill's association with animals was, as I've suggested, more than usually paradoxical. He loved faithful dogs but damned miserable curs, and he feared the black dog of depression that constantly prowled at his heels and sometimes jumped on his back. Andrew Roberts, in his recent book, rather dismisses this, but I don't think he's right about it. I think Churchill did suffer from depression, and he writes to Clemmy movingly about the fears that he had, sort of nameless fears, and he would never go near the edge of a platform on a station because he was frightened of wanting to throw himself out of it. So I think he was, and I think that's all to his credit, actually, that that he overcame this this feeling of depression, and probably overcame it via incessant work. He worked sort of via hyperactivity, one could say. He hunted foxes, but kept fox cubs at Chartwell as pets. He speared hogs, but scratched the backs of pigs, and he depicted himself as a pig. He loved both fish and fishing. Churchill was likened to Pooh Bear, but he warned that Red Bruin was padding across the steppes towards Europe on blood-stained paws. Later he added this thought: a bear in the forest is a matter of legitimate speculation. A bear in the zoo is an object of public curiosity. A bear in your wife's bed causes the gravest concern. Wherever you look in his life, his speeches and his writing, you find the creatures that have shared the earth with mankind through history. Churchill's life is, in key respects, an animal story. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Piers. Splendid.
Thank you.
Have we any questions? We are open for questions if you'd like to ask.
Very open to questions.
Did you have to run?
No, I don't have to run at all.
Oh,
No,
good.
absolutely not. No, I'm entirely at your disposal. I'm just looking to see how much time I've eaten up.
Oh, I have no idea. We went like that.
3/4 of an hour.
Maybe we have no questions.
Well, I'm just
Please.
so
There's a
fascinated.
microphone for you, just so we can get a...
Sorry. Oh, sure.
No, it's quite all right.
No, what a wonderful presentation. Number one, I'm so delighted. This is going to be a great Christmas present to several of my family members who have anthropomorphized. They're all of our pets as well. But I was as stunned as you must have been that this aspect of Churchill's life had never been plumbed, and luckily, I guess for you and for us, never written about. But are there? How do you explain that? And are there any other aspects of his life yet to be explored?
Well, take your question in two parts. How did I discover it? It was always sort of on the edge, Occasionally you find little anecdotes and so on. Put them together, you get an important aspect to his character. But, as I say, the files, I mean, the Churchill Archive Centre, which I was in charge of for 6 years, totally incompetently, I have to say. Alan Packwood, my successor, is far more competent and brilliant at what he does. But it contains 1 million pieces of paper in 2,000 boxes. It's an enormous repository. It's quite difficult to get through. And that Lowndes story, for example, I asked Martin Gilbert about that. You know, did he know about it? No, he didn't know about it. He may have forgotten, but you know, it didn't come out. So, if you look at the files devoted to the Black Swans, devoted to the extraordinary episode that I just described about the duck-billed platypus and the various other things, you start looking, you put together a gradual picture. And they are so interesting because Churchill was incapable, I think, of uttering a dull sentence. And, you know, when it came to sort of talking about the animals, he would write, you know, even if it was just a brief note to somebody to thank him for sending the coom duck. I mean, that's just a one-liner, really, that he said, you know, we'll make good subjects of them because these ducks came from India. It's a sort of life-enhancing thing. You start reading it, you get amused by it, you put the things together, and in the end, you've got a book. I think I was hopelessly. I think that I failed really to do what I should have done, which is probably just to tell the story as a kind of biography, but I wanted to do it in bestiary form to bring in each of the animals to show how they impinged on Churchill's life, which means that there isn't a story there, but there are lots of stories, if you see what I mean. And so that's how I came to do it, and found masses of material. Now, are there other aspects of Churchill's career? Now, that's very interesting. People, since the archives were digitized and opened up, and you can actually, I mean, you can apply, and they're now being opened up to individuals. I don't know whether you've got them, Barry, have you? But you can look at the archives, and you can actually get into them yourself if you pay a bit of money to Bloomsbury. And you can see the astonishing riches of them. So people have been writing books about, I mean, I suppose I review on average 2 or 3 books about Churchill a year, and read perhaps 5. I mean, exactly. I mean, it is amazing that Churchill and money has been something that somebody has, a banker, in fact, he is, who's just, David Luff, who's just gone into the extraordinary complexities of Churchill's financial arrangements, which would, you know, baffle anybody who's as financially illiterate as I am, you know. But he's done it. There are lots and lots of aspects. And I was Andrew Roberts' latest big blockbuster is very good. He didn't discover any sort of huge new things. He says that he relied on the King's diaries, George VI's diaries. That's true, but of course they had been used before. He relied on Maisky's, the Russian ambassador's diaries, which have recently been published, and 1 or 2 other things. And he scoured the archives, and he has, I would say, come up with some quite good stuff, hasn't he? Not earth-shaking, but I would say, I probably shouldn't say this, but I think I probably might be able to say that there's more new stuff in mine than there is in his in some ways, because these files just have never been scrutinized. And I'm sure Andrew didn't read files about Black Swans. And I'm not knocking his book at all. I admire his book. But there's huge riches there. And the Churchill Archive Centre is a peculiar organisation because it is actually it's what you would call the equivalent of 4 presidential libraries rolled into one. It's got Churchill's papers, Margaret Thatcher's papers, Gordon Brown's papers, and John Major's papers, four prime ministers. Plus it's got 600 additional collections, slightly over now because Alan's collecting policy has been brilliant, And I mean, one of the first, my predecessor, about two, was a naval officer, senior naval officer in the First World War. And he got the papers. There are the papers of 40 admirals in the Churchill Archive Centre, as well as all these other things. But the collecting policy has to do with Churchill, the Churchill era and beyond, it's called, and therefore scientific matters, which he was very concerned about. And the college, of course, is a scientific college. They are diplomatic papers, there are military papers, and there are political papers. Those are the basic collecting policy. So there's a huge, not just the sort of core elements, but a huge amount of papers in addition. And somebody's just about to produce a very interesting book about Sarah Churchill. Sarah was Churchill's second daughter, and she had rather a tragic life, really. But her papers have recently been catalogued and released. And so, the second generation, Mary Soames, whom I knew very well, her papers are all there, and I was allowed to use. They gave me access, actually, to Sarah's and to Mary Soames's, which was very kind of them, in order to write this book, because they knew what I was up to. Emma Soames has been very good about it. This is a terribly laborious and footling kind of reply, but the answer is that there's lots, I think, still to come. Yes.
Is there anything good on the depression question?
On the depression.
Yeah, on Churchill's personal.
Oh yes.
What would you
Yes.
recommend on that?
Yes, there is. You're talking to somebody who is in the early stages, I suspect, of dementia, and I cannot remember the name. Barry, it's Four Faces in the Man, and he's an Oxford psychologist, and he's written most interesting about that. And I can find it for you, but I can't dredge it out of my mind. But yes, there have been interesting things written about him. Andrew is peculiar about it. He's defensive about it, and I don't think one should be defensive about psychological problems. One should face up to them. I quoted in my review of his something that Churchill said about the nameless terrors that overcome me at some times, so if he's talking frankly like that to Clementine, and I think he mentioned it to other people, and he used this term black dog, which I talk about a little bit about in my book, about where the term comes from and what it's all about. If only I could remember, his name begins with an S.
Taylor.
No, it's not.
Four Faces in the Man.
Four Faces in the Man, and the final essay. The final essay is written by an Oxford psychologist, who wrote to me, as a matter of fact, about when I wrote my book. Interestingly, and he wrote to me and said, I agree with your interpretation of Churchill, which was rather flattering to me, but unfortunately, I can't do it. If you give me an email, I will tell you who it is. Yes.
One of your slides mentioned Churchill's brother, I think Paul. I'd never heard of a brother, any mention of him. What became of
Jack Churchill? Yes, his name was Jack. Yes, and he was. It's very mysterious, actually. He never sort of loomed very large. He didn't achieve very much. He became a stockbroker, and he was in the military to start with. The way history plays games with you, he went out to take part in the Boer War at the same time that Churchill was out there, and they were standing together, and I think a shell exploded near them, and the brother Jack got wounded and taken aboard his mother's hospital ship, and Churchill was unscathed. That was the kind of thing that happens. So I would say he's the unlucky brother. He didn't have the fire, the mysterious magic that Churchill had, not the ambition, the driving ambition that Churchill had. I mean, Churchill's ambition was quite extraordinary. It sort of pushed him on. You know, at the age of sort of 18, 19, 20, he was saying, "I'm going to be the Prime Minister of Great Britain." Still, we've got another one like that now, and not in quite the same vein. But Boris Johnson's book really was, as I just said to Barry, it was a kind of job application. You know, it was saying, you know, we're very similar, and I think perhaps they did have ambition in common. But Jack never really made it. Churchill was deeply fond of him. There were suggestions that he was not Lord Randolph's son, but I think these are probably groundless. There was, I mean, I talked to Mary Mary Solmes's last surviving daughter about Churchill's syphilis, about Lord Randolph Churchill's syphilis, and she was perfectly frank about it and thinks that it was syphilis. There are various ideas that it wasn't syphilis, it was something else. So she was not about to hide things like that, but she never had any doubts about Jack's legitimacy.
Are we done?
We come to the end of the road. We had about an hour. Yes, we
Terrific.
had about an hour.
Well, thank you very much. That was
It's a
just
pleasure.
splendid. And thank you all for coming. I should use this. And we'll be selling books now, as you may imagine. And please join us, and we'll have one signed for you. Thank you.